sense of fun, great passion, and a lot of love. And for me, those three words sum up Dan Topolski. Real loss to the world of rowing, let alone his friends and, of course, his family. But I'd just like to just make a brief tribute to Dan, really. He was a guy that I saw at World Championships and regattas and Henley, and we were club mates. First, when I first came to London Rowing Club back in the 70s, Dan was one of the big personalities there. Already then Oxford coach, he'd been in World and European Championships. And he was to stay that way, a massive personality in the world of rowing. And although I never went to Oxford or Cambridge, that was pretty much rowing in Britain during the 80s. And the winning crews were from Dan Topolsky's Oxford. So naturally, one was drawn to this figure who was not, in any sense of the word, conventional. And I think that was part of his appeal. The guy was a child of the 60s, a teenager in the 60s, growing up and going to university there with everything that entailed. I remember in later years at Henley's press box, he'd say, "Oh, have you met Jermaine?" And he'd just sort of point to this lady he brought along with him. It was Jermaine Greer, of course, author of The Female Eunuch, who was a great mate of Dan's, and he was that sort of connected. And I think the most attractive thing about him was he was not sort of a one-dimensional rower. A lot of rowing coaches and rowers now, all their life is just about rowing because it's got so professional. Dan took rowing very, very seriously, but he always had so many sides to him. He used to dress in a complete sort of raffish bohemian way, drive this pokey little Mini all around the streets of West London, the King's Road scene and so on. He was very alternative. If you'd seen him, you'd never have guessed that he was actually one of the most determined, committed rowing coaches in the world. And of course, what made him special, little guy, but was his drive and determination. He really, really pushed himself to get the most out of himself in terms of boat movement. He wasn't very big, so he used to have to make a lot of sort of gains with flow and fluidity. He had to try really very hard, and I think he knew when you didn't try hard, when he lost the boat race in '68, what that cost him. So when he came back to Oxford, he really instilled this toughness, mental toughness, determination, which pretty much is still a hallmark of the Oxford system today under Sean Bowden. And if you talk to the guys that were there with Dan Topolsky, a lot of people, Chris Mahoney, Nick Collington, Bland, Rankov, all through those years, the determination and the willingness to sort of follow the pattern that Dan Topolsky laid out pretty much marked out what was rowing in the 80s, the Oxford strength. And of course, that was a great passion of Dan, but of course, his passion extended in so many other ways. The travel that he did all around the world in Africa. We wrote the books Mzungu, White Man's Africa, the travels in South America he did with his dad. It was not your normal kind of rowing coach type of thing. And I think especially what was very striking about Dan in terms of, love was the relationship he had with his dad, Felix Topolsky, the great artist. And it was fascinating to listen to Dan talk about his dad and all the amazing work that he did. And particularly, Dan made it his life's work to try and get a living memorial to his father, Felix, on the South Bank in the workshop that he used to have. And they made the memorial of the 20th century there. It was to Dan's. He had to work so hard to raise the money to millions to pay for that, and was very frustrated actually when it financially didn't have to work out and it turned in to a cafe. But you can still go and see and sit and have coffee and meals and see the work of Dan's father, and that's down to the work that Dan put in with his sister Teresa. He was always talking about his kids. And their travels. I mean, they seemed a little bit chipped off the old block. They've been, I think, to the Lycée up there in central London, and his amazing wife Susie. And I think Dan will be remembered by a lot of people, certainly by me as a colleague from working on BBC Sport with him. Me on radio, Dan took over from me as Gary Herbert's sidekick. I say that with respect because Gary commentated on rowing at 100 miles an hour. Dan Topolski was kind of the calm one. Let's sort of, keep cool, Gary, and let's inject a little bit of, technical awareness and expertise here. But the two of them made a very powerful combination, and they were British Rowing's commentary act, I think, from 2000 to 2012, which was Dan's last year as a commentator. He was such fun to be away with. I mean, in some ways, a bit like a Peter Pan sort of figure because you just had a laugh with him. He really was very, very knowledgeable, but he had the other side to him, so you could take rowing seriously, but then he could laugh at himself, and you could have conversations about anything: politics, art, literature, personalities. He was, for me, it was a real, as a youngster coming to the club, it was a real sort of wake up call. Think, wow, who's this guy? And the sport will miss him, and it's important to say, I think the sport is better for him, and partly rowing is like it is now, certainly in Britain, because of Dan Topolski and everything that he's done. So I certainly will miss him. I know from being down at the club at Moseley today, a lot of the lads will miss him, and I know from things already that have been said about him that he's an irreplaceable loss. But we're all better for having known him, so God bless Dan.